Good afternoon, everybody. It's mid-afternoon Saturday, and I am a couple hours late getting this to you. I appreciate your grace and patience with me this week with the holiday here and so many other things. And the topic that we have today is such that I wanted to stop and think and do a little bit of study and research about it as well. So I hope that benefits you in this video that I've produced for our teaching tomorrow for our simple churches. We'll be gathering tomorrow at 10 o'clock in our four simple churches across the campus and Zoom at noon again. And some special instructions on that here in just a second. But I hope I had a good and a great Thanksgiving week, as different as it was. But hopefully it was a great time with your immediate family and a time of thanks and rest and relaxation. Thanks for everybody who came out on Wednesday night and enjoyed the Zoom time together. It was great to see everybody and to talk and to share. Let's get right into things because I want to try to keep this short so that you can see it once or twice between now and our meetings tomorrow night, or tomorrow morning, I should say. So again, just heading on to things, we'll be praying together this Wednesday night, December 2nd at 7 p.m. So that'll be our normal Zoom time from 7 to 8 o'clock. And please just check in with us if you can't spend the whole time. It'd be great just to see you and to hear from you for a couple seconds, minute or two, together with your family, whatever the case may be. But just let us know how we can pray for you. We're trying to organize that around our simple churches as well. And those are important because we're trying to develop our relationships there in this, especially right now in this limited time of distancing and masking and things like that. So being in a large group doesn't allow that. These groups are where I'd ask you to make it a priority and to really, really focus your attention and your prayers on getting to know the people in that simple church. That's the opportunity ahead of us. And you'll see today, that's the commandment that Jesus gave us, is that we focus on our love for one another as a means of demonstrating to the world a new way of being human. We're learning how to do that. We'll continue on our video series this Thursday night with Ecclesiastes, so you can see that ahead of time, and I'll send the study guide out on Tuesday for you all to begin to prepare for that time on Thursday night. Ecclesiastes this week in the Wisdom series by the Bible Project. And then as well, our simple churches will be meeting tomorrow, like I said, in the various places. I'm going to try to get a list out to you of who's in that simple church, just so that if you're there and you don't see someone, reach out to them. Let them know you miss them. Let them know, ask them how they're doing. It's really, really incumbent upon all of us to take interest in one another throughout the week. That's not something that's my responsibility alone, nor that of our leaders, but we want each and every one of you to cultivate these relationships. And so reach out to someone who's in your simple group. Those lists are posted around the campus right now, but I can also send out a special email to each one of you and probably organize some Facebook Messenger groups so that they're organized around those simple church, and you guys can communicate back and forth to one another through those means too. Tomorrow we're going to celebrate a mini Lord's meal, and here's what that means. Please bring a small bottle of juice with you, grape juice, cranberry juice, whatever works for you, and a piece of bread or a roll or something you might have left over from Thanksgiving in a Ziploc bag, something that keeps it sanitary. But you're the only one that's going to be handling it. We're not going to share anything. We're not going to do anything big, but we do need to remember and be thankful to the Lord. The Thanksgiving meal is what Jesus gave us to do regularly, and we want to do that following this Thanksgiving holiday. So bring those with you just for you and your family in the cluster that you're in. We'll celebrate that there in the simple church, and it will simply be taking your mask down and sharing the bread and the cup at the same time, and that's up. So nothing more than 1 or 2 minutes. That's a lot more than what is going on in restaurants and things like that. So we're not going to have a snack or a full meal or anything, but just the bread and the cup in this case as a way of just focusing our attention on who Jesus is. You Zoom at noon, folks. We'll do the same thing over the TV as well, or over the Zoom connection. And if you want to have some snack and some other things with you, you certainly can do that because we're not limited with the COVID situation being online like that. But again, please remember that tomorrow. Just bring a small bottle of juice and something wrapped in in plastic, bread, anything that you want to use for bread, and we'll eat that together quickly. But we don't want to forget to do that, and it's been some time since we've been able to do that, so we'll do that together tomorrow. Please take note of that as well, and I'll try to make a note in the emails as they go out as well. Let's jump into the teaching for today. And that is, I've titled this one, For God and Government, the Best Citizens. That last week we talked about this idea of life in the middle. In other words, we serve in this intermediate role between God and His world, worshiping God and serving the world on His behalf. And Peter then begins to talk about where that role of a kingdom of priests begins to unfold itself. And the first one that he gets to specifically for the church at that time is that of citizenship in their part in the general order of things. And we see that in 1 Peter 2:13 to 17. So that'll be the focus of our teaching today and our discussions tomorrow. Let me go through these. These will be in the slides and you can read them. I don't want to go into those in detail, but we're in this middle section here in Peter's design structure or narrative design, literary design for his letter. They're in 2:11 to 4:11. And he's generally given us this hinge passage that we looked at last week that sets the tone for this whole section. And as you see there, following the pattern, we're going to go into this first section on 2:13 to 17, where it talks about submitting to Roman rule. And Peter's very specific about that time because it's in a context. It's historically Nero, Caesar, is on the throne, and Roman rule has spread itself around the world. And in northwestern Turkey today, where these believers would have found themselves, Asia Minor or Bithynia at the time, Pontus, Bithynia, Cappadocia, they would have been under this system. And so Peter is addressing how they are to live their lives as followers of Jesus, but in that world system, and he'll continue to do that in a variety of relationships. Generally, this is a household text. What Peter's doing here is we see these in Paul, where Paul addresses the whole household of God. Titus 2, Ephesians 5, 1 Timothy 3, 1 Timothy 5, where he gives them some instructions to the whole church as the household of God. This is a household text that we're now starting to look at in terms of directions to them. And this is another thing we often refer to as the Didache, the apostles' teaching. There were two types of teaching that we have in the letters, and we have them here in Peter. We've seen up to last point, chapter 1:1 through chapter 2:10, the kerugma. That is the gospel proclaimed, the proclamation of what God has done for us. Beginning in our passage last week, 2:11 on to the end, the focus shifts to how then we need to appropriately respond to what God has done for us in our lives and in living for Him. And so that's one way to think about the kerygma and the didache. And I know I pronounce that differently all the time. Kerygma is probably the better pronunciation. What God has done for us, how we respond to God. Kerygma, didache. Think about it in that way. This is focusing now on the didache, the apostles' teaching. Peter and Paul, prime examples, but we have it from the other apostles as well. But those are the two prime ones that we have in the New Testament. And we saw this hinge passage, and I highlighted a couple of things. Keep away from worldly desires, and be careful to live properly, leading to honorable behavior. Living in the world but not being like the world, and then living properly before that world in a way that's consistent with what God has done for us. So here you can see how the shift from the kerygma, the gospel proclaimed, to the life that the gospel produces is what Peter is focusing on. And today he'll get into the specifics of living under man's systems, governmental systems like the one of the Roman Empire at the time. And he sums it up as honorable behavior. What is that? What is that? And that's one of the questions that I put before you today, is to think about what do we mean by honorable behavior? What makes it honorable in light of what Peter is doing here? This was my summary thoughts from last week, this hinge passage, that we live in a world not as it should be, but in hostility to God's ways and purpose. And with His help, we are to live now in loving opposition to the world. Loving opposition. It's interesting way to think about it. Our lives are to be lived with a special purpose and with concern for others that is all rooted in Jesus. We cannot live in a hostile, combative way, nor in an undiscerning, go-with-the-flow attitude. Jesus' way is in the midst of those two extremes. We need to live in life in the middle there. That was the summary of my teaching last week. So let me step back for a second and ask you a question. Culturally, at the time that we're in, how would you prioritize these two concepts, freedom and truth? Which is number one? Which is number two? How would you think about that if someone asked you that question? And why might it be important to ask that question? That's where we'll start off tomorrow. Which of these two concepts is the most important in your thinking or in your understanding, or as you just think about them? Freedom or truth? Which one is first? Which one is second? Which one has the priority? Which one is secondary to that? I was listening to a podcast this morning and was struck by this the way that our world, in terms of the secular world, thinks about what religious freedom really is, and that's a big issue right now with the things that have happened in the election and so much of the political and the religious being mixed together in the whole scheme of things. And this was said some time ago. I'm paraphrasing it. From what I heard on the podcast, and I could hunt down the sources if you guys are interested in that, but it's not my idea, all that to say. But the phrase went something like this: Christians are free to believe and do what they want as long as it doesn't make a difference in things. That is a way that our secular society now thinks about religious freedom. Okay, for you to do or believe anything, just don't require anything of the rest of us. Don't change things. Don't think that it has any implications or influence on things. It's private to you, and it's wonderful. I'm glad that you have that. We all have different things of that. But it has to do with that last question that I asked you as well. But think about this as sort of the prevalent way that religious freedom is thought about in our society and our culture today. Have you understood it this way? How would you define religious freedom? Would it be, how is it different from these things? There's a lot more to dig into, but I thought those were interesting things to start off this conversation. The passage, I'll just take you right through it all together, one right after another, and then we'll break it down a little bit. 1 Peter 2:13 to 17, Peter says this: For the Lord's sake then, this is after that hinge passage last week, submit to all human authority, whether the king is head of state or the officials he has appointed. For the king has sent them to punish those who do wrong and to honor those who do right. It is God's will that your honorable lives should silence those ignorant people who make foolish accusations against you. For you are free, yet you are God's slaves. So don't use your freedom as an excuse to do evil. Respect everyone and love the family of believers. Fear God and respect the king. What we have, like I said here, is a household code. Just a second to make sure my sound is working here okay. Looks like it is. When talking about the household code, here's a little bit of an insight on what that household code is. Accordingly, when reading Peter's household code here, we are to understand that his concern to instruct in ethics is dominated by his social concern with how Christians are to live within the Roman Empire when that empire in part turned against them. These are not timeless exhortations, but timely words of advice for a community under serious threat. So in other words, there is not just a general principle here. There are some specific contexts that we need to understand about the world at that time that Peter is addressing. There is a historical and a cultural context for what Peter is saying here. So we need to be aware of that. That is not to say that Peter's advice is merely advice. Rather, it is to say that Peter is concerned with a special context for Christian living, and this context must be considered before one begins to apply it to our world. In particular, this context means that the first angle we pursue is the one that concerns Christian living in a modern society rather than personal ethics. So Peter is addressing a church living in Roman society at the time. We need to understand that and get our minds around that, and then think about it in terms of how we as a church family or as a community of believers live in modern society as well. It's not just a matter of our individual lives or our individual choices and our individual behavior, but something that ought to characterize all of us. So it's a household text. This is everyone is involved here. No one in the family of God, the local church, is left out of this. This is everyone finds a place in it and has a contribution to make in it. That's another way to say what he's saying here. So how would you summarize the passage we read just a few slides ago in your own words? What does it mean? That's the first step I encourage you to take right after watching this video, or even as you just read those verses. Stop the video and write down in your own words. What's Peter saying here? What does he mean to say? That's an exercise all of us need to engage in as in order to become mature and growing believers, and to be able to come and contribute to and to teach one another with the help of the Spirit in us. So I encourage you to do that, and I will encourage you to do that anytime you open up God's words. Summarize this in your own passage. What are the key ideas? What is the author trying to say here in his own in your words, but drawing from his. Let's take this first one and begin to look at it a little bit. We read it earlier, and you have it on the screen there with you. But the question I'd ask of this particular set of verses, are believers just to go along then with whether the authorities say or do? He said, submit yourself to every human authority. So whatever the state says goes, whatever the government says goes. Think about Peter writing at the time again during Nero Caesar. They were not exactly friendly to Christians and had much history with that back in Rome. We know Nero was a terrible, even perhaps somewhat insane, crazy, and egomaniacal leader. But yet Peter's speaking of the system and their life under his authority and the governors that he himself was appointed and sent to the various places, like the local area where each of these churches find themselves. But what about us today as well? Are we just to kind of roll over and say whatever? Well, it's a law, and that we just go along with it, or whatever decree comes out. Do we push back at all? And how does that work? How did it work then? How did it work today? We'll have some ideas brought forward on that a little bit as well. But here's a question to think about. One of the commentaries on this talks about one way of thinking about that in today's time. Again, there was a particular setting and situation that the churches were living in then. We have a different system today, but there's still a first principle here. But how we can think about the expression of that first principle is different for us. He says here that Peter preaches submission in order to prevent the government from turning against the church, as well as encourage others to follow Christ through the church. You can see the intermediate role of the church in both of those in that equation. As long as church members live within the order of society and do not live recklessly outside of society's standards, and as long as the government does not turn against them for this kind of action, then social acts of civil disobedience will be perceived as citizen-like behavior. In this sense, actions of this sort will not harm the cause of the gospel. So in our system, for example, there is a right to protest. There is a right to disagree. But there are acceptable, socially accepted and ways of doing that still protects and preserves the well-being of the community. We've seen a lot of that unfold this year. There are ways that are not good to protest. The innocent get hurt. The poor get poorer. The powerful get more power. And a lot of destruction and things like that happens. That is not the kind of thing that Christians ought to be participating in, because it is outside the norms of society. It is destructive to the larger community and individuals within it. So there's a standard for these things. That wouldn't have been the case in Roman days. There was a different standard or a different understanding of what that meant. But today we need to think about them in these terms. Ordering ourselves in such a way that we 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 want to benefit the community that we live in. We want to benefit the government that God has placed over us, and living between that tension, living within the standard and the acceptable norms, and using the space and the freedoms that we've been giving, as long as it doesn't turn either one of those against us, where we step outside of those norms. That's probably a good way to begin to think about this in terms of where our society is, because that won't be true in other societies around the world. They don't have those freedoms that we do. They have a different set of norms, and action that would be good for us could actually turn the government against them in an unnecessary way there, if it's not there's not something that clearly violates God's standards. So there's a lot to think about here in terms of not only what it means to serve the Lord, but also to be responsive and remain to be good citizens in the places where we live. Longer quote here that has to do with a little bit of this history and where this would have been coming from, because Peter would also have known from the history of the Jewish people that they found themselves in situations like this time and time again. Think about Daniel. Think about the stories that you see there of the people in exile, and varieties of situations like that. But there are classic examples of where God has given them instruction on how to live in the midst of a pagan world. That is a world that was worshiping things that are in the world and are inherent to the world, rather than the God who is above the world. That was one of the differences between who God's people are. God's people worship and follow the transcendent God and recognize his ultimate authority, and not the authorities that are here in the world below, as if they were the only thing, where there was nothing higher to them. That was what defines paganism. Paganism is real and rampant today because many, many people worship the good of this world as if that is the ultimate thing, whether it's inside us or out there to be found in the world. That's still paganism, and it's idolatrous. It's elevating the creation over the creator, and this is one of the key things to keep in mind that Peter is addressing here, and living in between the tension of those two things. He says in this quote in the Everyone commentary by N.T. Wright, "It remains the case, as Jews throughout the world of the day knew well, that though tyrants can behave abominably, at least towards God, not least towards God's faithful people, it is part of God's will that his created earth should be ruled and governed by human authorities. Order is better than chaos, even though order can turn into tyranny, and frequently does. And though our hatred of tyranny might lead us into the normal kind of revolutionary politics, which hasn't changed much from the first century to our own day, Peter advocates a different way. Be subject to the ruling authorities, but make sure at the same time that by your good behavior you shame those who out of folly and ignorance want to criticize you. That is how God is establishing his presence and his rule on earth as in heaven." Very important idea there. Oppressive tyranny and violent revolution are not the only options. Serving the true God by living a peaceful, wise, visibly good life is, in the end, far more revolutionary than simply overthrowing one corrupt regime and replacing it by, well, most likely another, as history shows. That's a very, very important idea. Serving the true God by living a peaceful, wise, visibly good life is, in the end, far more revolutionary than simply overthrowing one corrupt regime and replacing it. That's worth some thought and reflection upon. So some core ideas out of this first section. The world as it presently is, God has established rulers and authorities for some fundamental reasons. Law and order, protecting the weak and against the strong, or the innocent from the guilty, the honored from and the dishonored, in providing a peaceful coexistence between all of them. This authority operates at the highest level and at the local level in the world within which God's set apart for a purpose people coexist. So it's not just one level of government. This is about authorities all the way down to the local level, to the neighborhood level, to the school level. There are authorities all around us that help make the world operate as it does, for the betterment of everyone, at least for the hope to do that. And again, for just the protection of the innocent and the punishing of the guilty, and the order that's needed for life to thrive and for people to make wise choices. Their God-given purpose is one of order, and believers are to recognize and order their lives under this for God's purposes. The idea of submission is to order yourself. Hypotasso is the Greek word. To put yourself under the order of. God has established governmental order. We worship God. We therefore order ourselves and order our lives under God, but also under those authorities for his larger purposes. That's the way the idea works. God has set an order for human community, and he's setting that out in this household text, as we see in other passages of the New Testament, particularly from Paul. He goes on in this next section that we read earlier, that it's God's will that your honorable lives should silence these ignorant people who make foolish accusations against you. You are free, yet you are God's slaves. Look at the contrast there. Don't use your freedom as an excuse to do evil. When Peter says that this is God's will, what does that mean? And why is it God's will in this way? If most people ask you, or you ask someone, what is God's will? You probably wouldn't go to this passage. That your honorable lives should silence ignorant people who make foolish accusations against you. That's a strong statement. It's a clear statement. We know God wants us to do this. There's no questioning in it. But what does that actually look like? What are these honorable lives that he's talking about, and why in this way? Another supportive quote here, that Christians at times must speak out against the government, but it has to be done in a way that remains submissive, in the sense that Christians protest in ways permitted by society. This is following on from the idea we saw above. To be specific, Christians may protest at abortion clinics, and the Constitution gives them that right, but they may not protest in a way contrary to the policies governing such behavior, as when a self-proclaimed justice freak murders a doctor as a form of protest. Unacceptable. Not acceptable by societal norms in any way. Civil disobedience remains a right within the government policies of most Western democracies as legitimate social behavior. Some acts of civil disobedience are even perceived by society as a good thing. We've seen a lot of discussion about that over the past summer. Enabling the Christian to be both insubordinate yet within the parameters of good behavior. There's sort of the different space that we have in our modern Western societies, but yet there's a principle to follow here in the way of what Peter is talking about. Some core ideas here. The reality of who God is and what he is doing in the world through a new redeemed human society is the truth which should be wisely on display. That's our primary goal, is to demonstrate that truth, that wisdom, above all else, and in every way possible, even sometimes when that means protesting against, but within the norms of society. But it may get ire up on both sides. We have to be wise about it. At the same time, Jesus' followers answer directly to him and serve the world on his behalf, especially when that world and its authorities are corrupt. Speaking truth to power, we hear talk about that, and that ultimately is what it may come down to, but it's still spoken in a way that is caring and concerning, not vindictive. It leaves that role to God, but hopefully through an appeal and through a life that's willing to sacrificially give and seek the benefit and the welfare of others, people may change their ways, but if they don't, they will see that we are part of the solution, not part of the problem. Evil, then, is anything that places our own or man's purpose in place of God. It's the idolatry of things which are limited to this world. That's what's really at issue here. It is wrong for us to idolize freedom. It is wrong for us to put freedom or individual choices or individual rights and responsibilities above God's purposes or in the place of God himself. That's where sometimes things get a little fuzzy and get a little shaky here in our Western democracies. Freedom is not the highest ideal because it is something that is or may not be in this world. It certainly is a wonderful gift and a wonderful opportunity when we have it. And the ultimate freedom is found in our relationship with Jesus. But the truth of who God is and what he is doing in the world is what should be on display above all else. Because there are many, many times in history, and there are many, many places where we have brothers and sisters of the world who do not have those freedoms. But the truth for them and the truth for us that we have in the gospel and in who God is and what he's done for us in Jesus and what he's called us to is the same no matter what society that we find ourselves in. We need to be clear about those things as Christians, that those are not one and the same. Americanism, if you will, and Christianity. Those can be two very, very different things. We can worship some things as Americans that can encroach upon the areas that only God Himself is able to inhabit, and we have to be wise and be careful about those things, and we need to think carefully about those things, because nations come and go, and they have over history. Rome has come and gone, and the same may be true for our society as well. In 100, 200, 300, 400 years, we don't know. 1,000 years, we don't know those things, and that's very possible. These early believers didn't know when the kingdom would be consummated with Jesus' return, but they were living out of the reality now of who God was and who He'd made Himself publicly to be in Jesus and His resurrection, and were living on the basis of that, knowing that one day that was going to reach its fulfillment in Jesus, its ultimate height, I guess you should say, climax in Jesus' return. The last phrase is very, very simple and very straight to the forward, almost like, again, a summary of all that he's talked about, but in very, very short form. Respect everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, respect the king. Seems like a very, very comprehensive, all-encompassing statement. This is pretty general, but it's also hard at the same time. Respect everyone, love the family of believers, I can do that. Fear God, yeah. Respect the king, oh, now it's getting hard again. Respect everyone, respect the king, and the heart of it between those two things is loving the family of believers, the local church, your brothers and sisters in the Lord, fearing God, respecting Him, and holding Him in the highest regard over all of the things. And in the context of that, respecting humanity and others for nature being human beings, but also the king or the authority of the time and the place as God's agent for keeping order in His world. How easy it is for us in a very different climate of political thought, first to misunderstand what Peter is saying here, to imagine he's advocating an easygoing collusion with tyrants, and then to mock him for his naivety. The passages that are now coming up will show how wrong that attitude would be. When we wake up to who we now are, we will find all kinds of new challenges awaiting us, including the challenge to think right outside our usual boxes of social and political ideologies. Here is the power of the gospel and the transforming work that it is. We have to renew our minds in these things and not just accept the way things that they've always been or what we've always thought them to be, but we need to come to God's Word. We need to come to the first principles and renew our minds in them and be transformed not into only how we think, but how we live in a world that's rapidly changing, but needs to know and to see the timeless truths of who God is and what He's done in us, His presence in the world through us, as we've been talking about, as His kingdom of priests or His holy nation or His temple, a living temple that all of us make up. So some core ideas in this last set of verses. Believers are to look out at others in the world and see purposeful living and intent. Every person in the world, whether it be every other person or the king or the authorities, gives us a reason and a purpose for living the way we do. This is the core of being a benefactor community, that which seeks the well-being of the city and the human lives around it. It is a fundamental calling of the local church and ought to be obvious locally. That is our calling today, to seek the welfare of the city that we live in, or the cities in some of our cases. That is why God has us here. To be a benefactor to our world, just like He was to us, and He was to the whole world in Jesus. We reflect that calling and that vocation, and we need to do things and engage in things that make it obvious. And thinking about our role between government and what's acceptable as a society when we don't agree with that government, in such a way that we're in a position to speak to both sides, whether it's to power or to those who are like us under those authorities, and have a voice, and have a credible voice, not just because of what we say, but primarily because of what we do and how we do it. Note the focus on love within the believing community. This echoes Jesus' teaching that the world will know we are His disciples if we love one another in visible ways. Love the family of God. Show your love for the family. Show your respect for God. That's what He has in the middle of this. That's where our primary opportunity is, but it's not the only one. But it has to start there. The world needs to look at us and to look at how we care for one another, our concern for one another, our sacrificing for one another, because we really are family in Jesus. And our willingness and our ability to do that in great and sacrificial ways is a living testimony that something new is brought about in the world. We ought to be outdoing every charity and every organization out there as much as we can within the needs as we see around us, because it's our fundamental calling, and it's what we need to be about. We exist for those things. Remember, we saw last week that our purpose here, and I've highlighted, you can show others the goodness of God. He called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. We are lights in the world. We are candles, a city on a hill. And it's through doing these things and through thinking these ways, we can show others the goodness of God. So what problems or issues in our lives or ministry and culture today are being addressed by Peter here? We've talked about some of them, but what are some other things? Maybe this generated some other questions for you, and I didn't get a chance to integrate any of those that you may have sent to me, but would like to do that in our discussions tomorrow. So here's my summary of today. The broadest context for living proper lives is the context of the order within which we all find ourselves, or people find themselves, believer and unbeliever alike, but in a way that is rooted in God's purpose for his world in such a way that it will point them to the truth of who he is and what he is doing, made obvious through us as citizens, serving as priests between him and that world whose benefit we seek. We all live under government, believer and unbeliever alike. And so that's the broadest, the biggest playing field, if you will, that Peter starts out with, what it means to live good lives and to do good deeds, and to be careful in proper living. That's where Peter starts here, and he's going to move down into smaller and smaller spheres and more specific spheres of relationships like marriage and the family here very, very quickly. So I hope that was a good orientation for our discussion tomorrow, and you get a chance to think through these things. Write down notes. The slides will be in the Google Drive, and they'll be in the email that I send out here quickly, so you can get those, and I'll try to get this link out to you as soon as I possibly can, so you can begin to watch this and interact with it. And look forward to seeing you all tomorrow in person at 10 o'clock there on campus, or those of you who are with us in Zoom at noon tomorrow. And again, don't forget to bring that bottle of juice just for yourselves, and a piece of bread and a sandwich baggie that you can share with you and your family. We're not sharing across one another, just removing our masks for a minute or two to remember the Lord's death, the good gospel that we believe, and what makes us a family. We need to do that regularly. It's a good opportunity to do that. So God bless you all, and pray that you have a good rest of your Saturday here. Thanks for watching.